everybody for coming out on a Saturday to watch some trippy plant films together. I'm so excited for this turnout, and a big thanks to Selene, Juan, Camille, Sarah, the whole team at LACE for putting this film screening series together. It's been such a joy to work with them, so thank you. And it's my pleasure to have this amazing panel with us this afternoon as well, which I will introduce now. So starting to my right, we have Antónia Szabari, is a French and comparative literature professor at USC with a PhD from Johns Hopkins. She's the author of 3 published works, Less Rightly Said, Scandals and Readers in 16th Century France, which focuses on elite satire by examining its rise, which enhances our comprehension of printing and reading culture, the role of invectives and discords in early modern French society. Radical Botany, Plants and Speculative Fiction from Early to Late Modernity, which explores a new way where plants envision their futures, which we'll be talking more about today. And Agents Without Empire, Mobility and Race Making in 16th Century France, on race making in the 16th century, employing diplomatic communications, religious texts, poetry, theatrical works, persuasive materials, and the natural world. We also have Perry Lee Pipkin, who's a field botanist with dual bachelor's degrees, a BFA in ceramics and a BS in natural resources in ecology and botany from Oregon State. Perry's traveled across the United States to work with institutions such as the Mojave Desert Network, the University of Idaho, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the Montana Natural Heritage Program. Pipkin currently works as a research assistant at the California Botanic Garden. They're interested in plant diversity and human intersections with the botanical kingdom. Their continued work in botanical conservation connects with socio-environmental justice. We have Star Feliz, a Dominican-American artist originally from New York, currently based here in LA. Building upon their ancestral Afro-Taino lineage of multi-dimensional healing, Feliz employs sound, sculpture, film, earthworks, and techniques of concealment, language, and mapping to transverse the psychic legacy of everyday resistance and world-making. Under the moniker of Priestessy, they create experimental devotional music. Feliz is also the plant spirit medicine healer and founder behind Botanica Cimarron, a brand focusing on bridging connections between people and the transformative healing power of nature. They have exhibited, performed, and presented commissions nationally and internationally. They are the author of When I Land and a contributor to the upcoming anthology, Confluence of Witches, celebrating our lunar roots, decolonizing the craft, and re-enchanting our world. And last but not least, we have Natania Meeker, associate professor, but also French and comparative literature at USC. Her book-length projects include Voluptuous Philosophy on the Cretaceous and 18th Century Materialisms, Radical Botany, Plant Life Speculative Fiction, and a recently completed manuscript prospectively entitled Illusion Without Error on Femininity and Theories of Matter in the Enlightenment. Together with Antónia, she co-edited an issue of L'Esprit Créateur on libertine botany. She is currently at work on a new book-length project on vegetal biopolitics and human sexuality entitled Vegetal Materialisms and the History of Sex. This book seeks to expose the profound impact of vegetal life on the genealogy of human sex and sexuality. So please join me in welcoming this amazing group. And just to kick us off, I wanted to hear from everyone, what started your interest in plants?
Okay, I'll start.
Don't be shy.
So I guess I have kind of always been interested in plants. I grew up pretty rurally in the northern mountains of Taiwan, and a lot of my neighbors were farmers. It was pretty rural, so I saw both people in relation with plants through cultivating them, and then also kind of just acknowledging the wild spaces around. And then more recently, I got interested in plants as an adult, I think through kind of spending a lot of time in the outdoors, working seasonally, and then finding herbal medicine, exploring plants that way, and then through, I guess this sort of all led me to this place where I was working with them, and then started to think about how I'm taking and like receiving from these plants, how can I be show reciprocity in this relationship, and so that led me into the field of conservation botany, and that's where I am today.
Well, I have a much less moving origin story. I got interested in plants through a conversation actually with Antónia about Aristotle, who divides the soul into three parts: the vegetal, the animal, and the rational. And we began talking about that division, what it might mean, what implications it would have for humans. And then we started, for some reason I don't remember, talking about plant horror films and the way in which they invoke a kind of animate vegetal that may or may not be ensouled, and that has different disturbing effects on people. And so that was sort of the moment when I started getting interested in thinking about them with plants.
Do I need to turn this on? Is it on?
Thing on, guys?
Okay, thank you.
So I think that's a good way of starting. It's also definitely one of my entry points into botany. Natania and I started thinking about, first of all, what sort of materialism can be found in Aristotle, not per se a materialist philosopher, but still a thinker of the material world. I also have a more personal origin story. I grew up in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Hungary. It's very close to Ukraine. And so that landscape, I think we are all lucky if we have a place where we have this kind of early experience of non-humans. And for me, it's kind of the westernmost part of the Eurasian steppe and the easternmost part of Europe. So definitely that, and also it's in a very agrarian world, going back many, probably not just centuries, but thousands of years, and also I've had the luck of growing up during state socialism, so it was also an agrarian world of collectivized farming. I think when I met Natania, she introduced me to thinking about materialisms that are not teleological, which was a huge intellectual fascination, or became a huge intellectual fascination for me. So I think those are my starting points.
Well, first off, thank you for having me here. I'm really grateful to be back at PRS and to be among an amazing group of inspiring filmmakers as well. I've always felt very connected to the plant world and to the natural world in general. I think it was always an intuitive connection, even though I grew up in the middle of Manhattan, and many people don't see that as that being a place that's connected to nature. Similarly to Los Angeles, right? There's a lot of urbanization, concrete that's poured over, these ancient land histories that are still very much present and with us today, so I was always like escaping to the rivers and to the caves. There's caves in Manhattans, and building connection with like the earthworms and the trees that were around me, and I come from a very earth-based people. My family is from the mountains of Dominican Republic, and just kind of like through growing up and hearing their stories, and also kind of learning more about the ecology of New York City, as well as like our own displacement as Afro-Indigenous people, and the displacement that continues to happen in urban areas, and the ways that the same language of like disconnection, right, of colonialism is also used in gentrification. So just kind of always seeing those connections. yeah, so I guess that's kind of how it started, and from there, just continuing to build relationships wherever I'm at. Which, yeah, I've been very lucky to learn and to be part of different land projects throughout this landmass.
Great, thank you. I love everyone's plant origin stories. I want to ask everybody in the audience this now. But I'll move on to the next question, which is for Antónia and Natania, which I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your book, Radical Botany, how you define radical botany in the book, and then as a follow-up to that, kind of why is it important to think about plants historically?
Do you want to? I could start with something, and then maybe you can respond, and we can say a few things. I don't really want to. I don't presume to summarize our argument completely, but I think we call radical botany the moment, and especially the book is about fiction, right? It's mostly about speculative fiction taken in a very broad sense. And we call radical botany the moment when the vegetal or plants become the model for human life, which includes an experimental moment of aesthetic estrangement, I think, and everything that comes with it. So maybe that's sort of my starting point.
Sure, yeah. I think, and you'll correct me if I get it wrong, Antónia, but for us, radical botany is a botany that is not invested in the objectification of the plant or in the treatment of the plant as a purely manipulable or passive object. And we saw that, I think, in the films. And it approaches the plant as a unique form of life, a form of being that is, in certain ways, I think, represents an alternative to anthropocentric ways of living, but also causes us to ask, us as humans, to ask how we are dependent on plants for our ways of life, and how we might collaborate with them. And I think to speak a little bit to the question about why I think historically, and in watching the films again, I was struck by the different histories that they unravel or excavate or present. I think there are many reasons to think about plants historically. One is to try to see and to feel and to understand the ways in which plants and people have always collaborated, and to try to understand the effects and influences of plants on the spaces and places that we inhabit, but also the histories of harm and violence that have been done to people and to plants, often in the name of progress or science or indeed utopia. But I think it's also important to think specifically about plants in history because they trouble and complicate our ideas of what it means to tell a history or to have a history to begin with. The second film, the Density of Breath film, which is set in an 18th century context, or evokes that context, I think poses the question of what it means to have an event from the perspective of a plant. How does thinking with and through plants allow us to understand the passage of time differently, and how does it allow us to understand historical events differently? Not just from a different perspective, but as a different set of comings together and travelings and movements.
And I think kind of following up on that, unless you had something to add. Yeah, these kind of histories of harm and violence, and you mentioned the film Density of Breath, which I think deals with how plants have been bound up in these colonial histories, colonial ways of seeing. And I wanted to ask the group, how you think about this work of decolonizing our relationship with plants, and what does that look like for you in your work?
I can speak a little bit just to, I guess, the science side of this question in terms of conservation and botany. I work as a botanist, and most recently, the past few years, I've been working in an area that's deeply impacted by renewable energy development. So this huge mountain range that is slated for lithium mining, geothermal energy, salt mining, like salt brine mining, different types of hard rock mining and huge, vast areas of solar development, because this huge transmission line is coming through the area. And it's really close to areas that are national forests and national parks, which we know all of these were established by the removal of indigenous people from these lands to make them, it's almost like, we call it fortress conservation. So you kind of rope everybody off and remove connection from land. And so for me, I see a lot of this like very colonial-based history in the way we try to conserve land, and then the way we are trying to use land today. So it's this like devaluing of very vulnerable members of our, like I view plants sort of as our greater community, and so these rare plants or like compromised ecosystems or just plants in general are typically very devalued. And I think that's kind of a reflection on the way that we have collectively society has treated, like the histories of colonization has treated non-white or non-human lives or just everything and anything as disposable. And so I think we see that played out in the way extraction occurs, and and so that's just to touch the surface, but that's kind of how I see this happening in the world that I'm involved in.
Maybe we can all speak. I just want to let others.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that, and I'm honestly at a loss of like where to start. I think also because it's kind of been my whole life. It's work.
Just 5 minutes, you know.
Yeah, I guess to start, maybe I want to respond to part of what you were saying, and and I love that you mentioned that even thinking about the current, like, I don't know, like the image or the aesthetic of like what it is to be connected to nature and who is like the natural person or the ecological warrior, and how, you know, there's like Patagonia, National Park Service, right? Like all of these signifiers of like of access in a certain kind of way. I say this all to say, right, because like the National Park Service is like crucial to the removal of indigenous people to the land, right, and seeing how a lot of, right, like the connection to the Bureau of Land Management, right, that is in charge of extracting resources, and how a lot of national parks are on territories are resource rich, right? So we can maybe see the connection there without me needing to point to it, but so that's something that I was thinking about while you were talking. In terms of one way in which the decolonization, you know, is very relevant in my life today as an herbalist or as a person who's a plant spirit medicine worker, right? I've been working with plant medicine pretty much all of my life, mostly in a non-formal way until about like 10 years ago when I started to see clients and teach workshops and like work with other healers outside of my own community. And I felt very like ostracized in the Western herbal world, I think because the language and the education around it, like everything felt very extractive, and very much about like, you know, it was a lot of, as much as I, you know, phytochemical, like that's important in chemistry and biology, but you know, like there wasn't this holistic understanding of plants and really the nature of healing. And, you know, with the way that I connect with them, it's very much through the spirit, right? Like plant spirit communication is the basis of my herbalism practice. Like it's a co-creative relationship. It's a partnership. It's not like I'm just making choices on my own in order to like go in and like cure or change something, right? Like the plant is the ultimate healer, and as an herbalist, as a healer, right? Like we're a channel for that intelligence to flow through and really like, you know, the human partner to make it happen. all that to say that, yeah, as someone that I think I've entered more into the herbalism space. I think that's one way in which maybe just by being and being authentic in the way that I practice healing, that decolonization is happening. Yeah, I also think that there's so much there, right? Because like decolonization requires the eradication of structures and the actual, structural change and shifts of power and an absolution of power and of hierarchies. And yeah, in my work, I tend to focus on like disconnection as being a tenet of the way in which colonization, works through all of us and in our everyday lives, and and in like having those authentic partnerships and building those flow relationships with not just the plant beings in our lives, but being in presence with all that is in our lives, whether it's the people or the land, our own bodies, and the way that, they might be screaming at us sometimes to listen, and all of these things. That was a bit of a ramble, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
Did you maybe have any ideas about the final film, Fainting Spells, which seems to be about the healing power of plants precisely, and it also evokes through a kind of creative fiction of a new mythology, indigenous culture. It seemed like that was closest to what you were describing. I don't know if you had any ideas about it.
Any general ideas about the film?
Ideas?
I love Sky's work. I loved the film. That was my first time seeing it. I thought it was really powerful. There's still things that I'm digesting about it. I wish I had direct things to say. But what were your thoughts on it?
I think I've seen it now 3 times. It's very interesting. I mean, I love the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. I was the Potawatomi American plant biologist who has devised this way of weaving colonial science and indigenous plant knowledges and together. So that was kind of my reference point running through as I was watching. Also, Kimmerer talks a lot about making up rituals because of the disconnection. And I'm wondering the disconnectedness and the cataclysms, right? Part of, I think, what we were interested in with Natania, we're working on a European tradition, so it's a different place. But the idea that speculation can help us through cataclysms and upheavals, that's why I was keep going back to Kimmerer, who talks about this, how her father invented a ritual where they were pouring coffee, I think, on the campgrounds, and later on he admitted to her that this was not an authentic ritual, but then she adapts it as an important part of her indigenous culture, and that's what the film evoked to me. It was an invented myth, right, of a very actual plant, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
And just to pick up on something about that too, what I found interesting in that film is that's a plant that works on the nervous system. So it's kind of talking about like a somatic relationship to plants, whereas in some of the other films, I think we see that disconnection that you're talking about more clearly. Like there's all these like ways that humans are distanced from plants, whether they're through these greenhouses or through like the mechanism of the camera, but I think in painting spells it feels very like evocative on how it like affects us on a really like bodily, corporal level.
I had one more comment, and I don't know exactly what to do with it, but as we were watching the film about density of breath, Jamaica Kincaid's work came to my mind, and it was about the breadfruit, right, and how colonial networks of exchange allowed the seeds to disperse, a kind of vegetal diaspora, and then they talked about how that breadfruit fed enslaved people on plantations. But actually, Jamaica Kincaid, who was an Afro-Caribbean author, but taught at Harvard University, later on in her life, she talks about in her garden diaries how much she dislikes the fruit precisely because it was brought into the Caribbean to feed enslaved people on plantations. And so this kind of disconnect with, she also often talks about how she doesn't know the flora, the original indigenous flora, this kind of disconnect with the past, right? This kind of cataclysm or trauma is also important, I think. And she actually dealt with it by creating her own gardens. She would order seeds from these major gardening catalogs in Vermont, and she controlled her own space, and also reflected on the colonial history of all that you just talked about also, Perry. Yeah. So I guess there are different kinds of ways of constructing and creating. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to mention her.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to talk about plants and sex. So we see that, in Orchid Show, there's a long kind of history of plants, sexuality, gender, and I know folks have kind of worked on this in different ways. So I'm curious, what folks would say plants have to teach us about this?
I guess I can jump in and start. And I guess I wanted to say a little bit in response to the last question too, that I'm always interested in the ongoing work and process and struggle and pleasure in the reckoning with these histories. So your first question was a personal question in a way, and then you evoke the kind of bodily, the way in which plants and bodies are intertwined. I'm always sort of struck by the way art, film, the engagement with the plant is also about a sort of redeployment of the body, redeployment of perception. Like art works with us, plants work with us. You also invoked that collaboration with the plant that shifts our perception. And I think that sort of shift in perception, that shift in feeling is visible in the history of human and plant sexuality, which is in many ways is a kind of collaborative history in good ways and bad ways. The 18th century is a very important moment in the Western context. It's when plant sexuality is quote unquote discovered. But I've gotten interested in the way in which that so-called discovery involves a kind of projection, not of human categories onto plants, although that is there, but a projection of vegetal qualities onto human life, so that it's the sexuality of plants, which is a malleable sexuality, it's a flexible sexuality, in many ways it's a fluid sexuality, it's a strange sexuality in other ways, becomes a model for how humans might interact with one another, and the malleability and potential flexibility of human society and human desire. So that these very disturbing moments in the history of Western botany, for instance, or the history of colonialism or colonization, are also coupled with these moments of a kind of redeployment of perception, a retraining of perception that allow a new set of possibilities to emerge for people and for plants. So this kind of doubleness of that history that has not gone away, I think is striking in the case of plant sex, striking in the case of the way plants become models for what it means to colonize. You see that in 18th century French philosophy, where Philosophers talk about colonization as a form of, as visible in vegetal life first, and talk about plants as a way of thinking about what it means to be at home in a place. This very disturbing use of the plant, but it also shows the way in which that entanglement between plants and people runs so deep and requires kind of constant work of thought and action and healing too, I think, to get at. That was a bit of a ramble as well, but just wanted to link together a little bit the history of sex and the history of decolonization and botany.
I'd also love to add from a botanical perspective, I think just kind of surface level, something that we can also learn from plants, like plants present as like from a biological sex perspective, there's like the ovule bearing, the female bearing, and then the sperm bearing, the male plants, but there's also what we call perfect flowers, which have both, and then there's so many more combinations. There's not just male, female, hermaphroditic, sometimes there's like sterile parts, sometimes there's different proportions. Some plants open as female one day and male as the next. And so I think that in a society that is so like hell-bent on being like, there's a binary that you must be in, and like, it's really comforting for people who don't feel like that reflects the way they experience the world, to see themselves reflected in nature, to be like, you are natural, you're part of this world, like you're reflected in all these different varieties of plants, and there's no right way to be, and you can change your mind, and you can just, there's so much variety in the floral kingdom, and so I think that that's really helpful for people who don't feel super comfortable with the binary. So just on that really basic level, I think that it helps people see that your like natural part of nature is supposed to be the way you are, despite what the world around you is telling you, what the human narrative is placing on you.
I think one of the things we kept saying with Natania is that plants are so incredibly strange, right? So different from us, including their sexuality, but they're also so ordinary at the same time, which is what one of the things we discovered. We discovered these weird stories. One of them is by Anne Richter, a Belgian nature sci-fi writer, kind of a feminist sci-fi writer, about a woman potting herself and becoming a plant, and kind of it is about women's liberation, right? It's from the 1960s, but it's also about living a very ordinary life at the same time. So what can you do? What sort of pleasures can you and that plants are almost like guides in this sense. We kind of wrote a little bit against, but also a little bit against Deleuze, and if you're familiar with that kind of 1960s theory of libidinal liberation, plants seem to tie us, and similarly to say Haraway's argument with Deleuze, tie us to the ordinary, right? To limitations of our body and their bodies, and they always remain in that smallness in a certain way. So this duality of they're so strange, they photosynthesize, they have this sexuality that that is way more fluid than ours, is what you both say, but then at the same time they're also so ordinary. They can be potted, they can be observed. Yeah, they're small. I mean, in general, not always. Yeah.
I feel like flowers especially have such a beautiful way of like reflecting back to us our own expansive, expressive nature and the power of that. And like when I think about plant sexuality and queer sexuality, I think about like just the primal nature of like being alive and feeling and pleasure, and like, no matter how that is expressed, and or who that's expressed with, or at what time, it's like, you gotta like, right? It's kind of like that density of the earth and the soil, and it kind of like that kind of maybe like gritty, dark, almost like dangerous thing that I think was also or that hauntiness that was coming up in Sky's film, right? Where it's like we are of the earth and we're connected to the sky, but we're like, it's like just you gotta poop, you gotta fuck, you gotta like do these things that kind of like bring us down to just the primal nature of what has allowed life to continue recreating, and that's the expressive power of creativity in like a myriad of ways.
It's hard to say anything more than that.
I did want to ask, this has kind of come up that plants are conscripted in all kinds of human narratives. It's easy to project on them, but in some ways, and I think you all have written about this and have kind of touched on it in different ways, they also resist us, or they resist our attempts to fully understand or represent them. And I wanted to know, everyone's thoughts on, what it means to engage with forms of life that are so radically different from our own.
Well, I can say something about that. I guess this is a little bit of a personal comment. I think for me, thinking and writing to a certain extent, they emerge in two kind of processes. Pleasure on the one hand and struggle on the other. And I feel like plants as co-conspirators and as beings, they're extraordinary at providing pleasure, and they're also extraordinary in the way in which they require a kind of struggle to think with them. I'm not going to say to understand them, because I don't fully understand them or even partially understand them. But I'm always struck, plants historically have been, for ages, manipulated as beautiful objects, right? They have, they often seem to us to have an aesthetic kind of propensity, and they've been linked to femininity for that reason too, right? Like they seem like they're easily kind of distillable into lines. But even if we're looking at the orchids, there's that kind of profusion of color, or the expansiveness that you evoke. Those are all qualities that I think bring a good deal of pleasure, and that stimulates, I think, thought in those feelings. But at the same time, they're always receding a little bit from us. I don't want to say we have to chase after them, but I think with plants, one has to be thoughtful about the encounter, because it never is quite natural for a plant and human to be, or let me put it this way, it never, to me, feels quite natural to ascribe a certain set of characteristics to a plant. I always feel like in that ascription, I'm doing a kind of violence. And I want to be thoughtful about that, and I want to kind of do justice to that gap that's always there, at the same time as I kind of pay tribute to the pleasure that plants induce so beautifully. So it's a two-sided process.
I mean, that just seems so far away from the concerns of our world, even though we're so embedded in their breath. If I want to say something metaphorical, they seem so indifferent to us compared to higher animals or other people. And yeah, I think when we throw our own desires at them, they kind of don't always benefit from that. But at the same time, I mean, for me, that opens up a space for speculation, for seeing ourselves as, I mean, after all, we are related. We are we are in kinship. One of the things that Natania and I were fascinated by is that this recognition of kinship is not just doesn't just happen in evolutionary science. Obviously, that one really confirms it. starting in the 19th century, but already in Greek philosophy, it's there in an ambivalent way. So maybe they pull us to see ourselves differently rather than admiration is not always the best thing for them. But I think, Perry, you have said some wonderful things about this when we were conversing earlier. Yeah.
I'll try to remember what I said.
You said something about your work when you work with plants.
Yeah, well, I guess I can start. Maybe this will jog my memory, but I was sort of thinking as everyone was talking, like, why it's important to engage with life that is so radically different than how we experience the world, or just than us in general. Just, it kind of reminds us that we're just one of many species on this planet, and when we engage with these other life forms, like whatever type of plants, even like animals or anything else, but plants especially, because they don't have eyes, they can't look back at us, we can't necessarily immediately relate, and there's a lot of room for us to project onto them. But I think just developing these relationships with things that are unfamiliar to us, like, helps us see our place on this planet, and helps just, I think, generally build compassion and hope that we can work somehow. I guess maybe this is like part of seeing the multi-species future thing, where we this is our planet to share, not to own. And so I think engaging with plants, whichever way you engage with them, I don't think there's a right or a wrong way. I think just that you engage is important. I think that just helps us see our place, and know that we're part of a fabric and not like the main characters necessarily.
I did like the way the little video in the orchid show exposed our voyeurism. That was, I don't know if anybody else has comments on that, but it kind of framed the human activity inside the spectacle of the plant. I just, maybe that belongs here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the kind of the spectacle and the exotification of certain plants, definitely mirrors the kind of human propensity to want to prop some values up or some things up, and then and kind of ignore others, right? There's a whole show that's dedicated to orchids. Meanwhile, plants I don't know, bananas, corn, maybe are more typical agricultural, or now what are considered agricultural products, but are also masterful plants with immense human cultural symbolism. Long-standing connection. There's so much there, and I think that's also a point of diasporic plant history, right? That was always something that struck me growing up, and going to places like Whole Foods, where the plants that I think that I and my family really wanted to access, that were really important to us, were really expensive and propped up as this superfood, and I'm this is wrong. But also, right, in relationship to that, I also just kind of wanted to bring up some plant story connections, relationship to sexuality, kind of going back to the, right, so I wanted to mention the peacock flower, right, another aspect of sexuality is having agency, and the peacock flower is a very important plant in Caribbean history, as it allowed people to take agency over their reproductive health, and to force the period cycle, and to have abortion, right, and to have to evade unwanted pregnancies, so that their children weren't born into enslavement, for example. And I think yes, there's a lot of projection that we can do onto plants, and I think part of that has also allowed connection and liberation to happen, right? Thinking about, for example, the Victorian era when flowers really became a way for queer people to signal, I'm queer, I'm cruising, right? Like the violet being a strong symbol of lesbian culture, right? And there's a whole another list of plants that people would wear as lapels, to just brightly call our people towards us. And then wanted to answer your question about relationship. Totally spaced out.
Yeah.
But
Engaging with the radical other that is the plant. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that being in connection with plants has taught me a lot about healthy relation. Honestly, plants have taught me how to be in relationship with humans, how to be in healthy relationship with humans, right? Think about us me, let's say before I'm going into communion with a plant, I'm very aware of my own energy and grounding into my own energy and what's mine. And, coming to a plant with so much respect, not wanting to consume or to force my energy on it, but just like, hey, if you're willing, let's meet together for a little bit and connect and exchange, and then we'll pull back, and your energy is yours and my energy is mine. And it's very liberating and empowering to have those kinds of boundaries. And right, and you brought up writers like Jamaica Kincaid and Robin Wall Kimmerer, both of which are amazing. And if y'all haven't read, I highly recommend. And that's something that I love about their writing, is that it's very embodied, and you can get a sense of their journey and their relationship. And I think that rubs off on people, and I feel like, especially now, we're at a time that we're realizing that it's important and it's necessary, and it's part of, I think, hopefully the vision that we all have for how we want to carry on in the future.
And one of the things I'm hearing you say too, which I think is so interesting and instructive, is almost let's just get to know each other a little better, with plants. It's not assuming total understanding in the way that, some of these more kind of colonial scientific modes of being with plants are. It's kind of a modest claim, but a beautiful one. I might not never fully know you or understand you, but we can get to know each other a little bit better. So we have a few more minutes, and I wanted to open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions.
Hi. I don't know if it's so much a question, but what I find interesting is that plants just operate at a speed that's way slower than us. So we don't really see what they're doing, but they're really very active in what they're doing. And also we can sense chemicals, but they send a lot of chemical messages back and forth with each other. If we could smell or sense it somehow, we go, oh, we know exactly what they're talking about. So I just think that's interesting, that it's just sort of a physical constraint of us being able to know plants.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting, that kind of what you're bringing up is that, what I'm hearing say is that the language of plants is a chemical language, they have a chemical vocabulary, and I think that that's something that the films are kind of dealing with too, of the limitations of human language, or the constraints in talking to plants or talking for plants, and they kind of use different strategies to kind of torque the language, even though it's always going to be somewhat imperfect. But I'm curious if other folks have thoughts on that.
But one way I would put it is that they don't really live in our world, as in they don't live in the world as in our phenomenological world, the world as we perceive it. We might live in their world, and that might be why we always have to think about how we relate to them.
And I think the relationship of plants to time has been important in the history of cinema and the history of film as well. And even very early on, there are people working with plants in the 17th and 18th century who remark on the fact that they are moving, but they're moving slowly, and the only way to kind of be in their world would be to imagine a technology that could allow us to kind of perceive plant time. And that technology, in a way, is cinema, or cinema is one kind of answer to that question of how to come into contact with plant time. So in that way, the plants kind of spur media creation. There's a collaboration there too, where the desire of humans to kind of perceive that time, perceive that other world, results in the construction of different technologies that are themselves collaborations with plants. Not only collaborations, they're also forms of exploitation and domination of plant bodies, I would say, but they also are at the same time collaborative. So.
Yeah, and I think we have to mention time lapse. I don't know how much you like time lapse photography of plants, Perry, but Natania and we talked with a few plant scientists before, and they always admit that they are fascinated. It's kind of an early 20th century genre, and there are just some really beautiful ones out there. For example, I remember this one of daisies where you can see them open and close as the day progresses. At night they close, but then there are the old ones that no longer close. So they're just these really poignant moments that time-lapse captures, even gives them personality in a certain way. And I don't know if Perry or...
I do like it. I also think that, plants are moving slower. They are talking in a way, like communicating in a way we don't necessarily communicate with right away. But I think it just demands something different of us. Like, it demands us to slow down and asks us to, if I want to see a plant open and close, I can't just sit there. It's not going to give me the immediate gratification that I'm used to and that the human pace is used to. But I can return and visit, and if I want to understand the plant at that speed and that level, it requires that I return to the plant and visit it and build a relationship with it, whether it's later in that day or throughout the season. I can watch the buds open to flowers, turn to fruits, and so it's much more, it asks for a lot more of our time in order to see it. So I guess that time lapse is very, very cool and very interesting, but I also think it is really nice that we can also access that by deepening our relationship with the plant. And also, I'm sure, in terms of herbalism and stuff, and the chemicals and things, just working with the plants in that different way, you are communicating and experiencing these ways that they communicate with you. But it's not the immediate gratification route. It's a slower relationship based route, I guess. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said too about plants inspiring this technological innovation, right? Because that's so totally advent of photography, right? It's this desire to to understand the light and to capture it and to work with it, and that's what plants do. They eat the light, and you see a lot of early photography, right? Cyanotypes, especially. I forget the name of the cyanotype artist. Maybe someone else will on this panel. But she was just taking, or not so much taking photographs, but making these images of plants, of mostly seaweed and ferns and other plant life. So it's very much there at the early history of photography, and I don't see them as, I see them as really fast, and we're really slow actually. I feel their communication is more like the light form, in its speed, and we're the ones that and they're working with us to kind of evolve our light bodies, right? That is the essence of plant spirit medicine, right? Of working with the imprint of the flower and water and light to create to pass on their imprint, their essence, for the purposes of moving energy. Yeah, of moving energy around. So yeah, I love the image of kind of us being in their time. We're just like the ants.
They certainly move energy there. It keeps reminding me of Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, which is a weird sci-fi tale set in a national park that's completely weirded by some alien civilization that uses photosynthesis to completely tweak evolution. And the book is so much better than the film. But yes, that's all about moving energy, and that's a kind of speculation on that, yeah.
So we are about out of time. If anyone would like to commune with plants further, we have a pop-up bouquet bar outside. You can put together your own plant bouquet. It's from Muddy Heaven Farms, which is an urban farm here in LA who do great work. So go check that out in the lobby, and please join me in thanking our panelists again. So such a lovely conversation.